The Vestal Virgins of ancient Rome were not merely priestesses. They were living symbols of Rome's most sacred power, guardians of a flame that symbolized the very life of the empire. To be chosen as a Vestal was to step into a world shrouded in secrecy and suffocating expectation. A world where youth was exchanged for obedience and personal desire was sacrificed to the insatiable appetite of tradition. From the moment they were selected, usually between the ages of 6 and 10, these girls were removed from the familiar comfort of their families, thrust into the austere and isolating walls of the House of the Vestals. Here, their education was relentless. They learned the rites of Vesta, the rituals to keep the sacred fire ever burning, and the intricate protocols that demanded perfection in thought and action. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon them like the oppressive Roman sun, and failure was a word that carried consequences far beyond the imagination of the ordinary citizen. Life as a Vestal was a paradoxical existence. On one hand, they were revered, honored, and elevated above ordinary mortals. They moved through the streets of Rome with a divine aura, their presence a reminder that Rome itself depended on their unwavering devotion. Yet, beneath the gilded admiration lurked a suffocating rigidity, a regime of rules so absolute that even a whispered misstep could invoke the shadow of doom. Each day was meticulously structured, a seamless dance between devotion and surveillance, where every action was a potential test of loyalty. And yet, the most sinister reality lay in the secret expectations of the cult. The initiation into the sacred fire was not merely a ceremonial formality. It was a test that bound body, mind, and soul into a covenant from which there was no escape. Historical accounts whisper of the psychological torment endured by these young girls, the quiet dread that accompanied the knowledge that any lapse in duty could lead to unspeakable punishment. The Vestal Virgins were bound to Rome not only through sacred obligation, but also through fear. The fear that even the slightest imperfection could bring disaster to themselves, their families, and the empire itself. Their existence was one of perpetual scrutiny, where privacy was an illusion and innocence was a fragile facade over an abyss of ritualistic demands. It was within this crucible of discipline and dread that the true horror of the cult of Vesta emerges. The lives of these women were not their own, their fates dictated by tradition, politics, and an unyielding appetite for ritual purity. Yet, the allure of the Vestal Virgins persisted, for Rome's citizens looked upon them with a mixture of reverence and envy, captivated by their proximity to divine power. Each flame they tended, each rite they performed, was a silent promise that the city would endure, that the gods were appeased, that chaos would be held at bay. And so, the young initiates, whisked away from childhood into a life of sacred terror, became living instruments of Rome's survival, their stories echoing through the ages as chilling reminders that devotion often comes at a price too high for mortal hearts to bear. If you're intrigued by the terrifying secrets of the Vestal Virgins and want to uncover more hidden truths of ancient Rome, leave a comment below. Give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe, because the darker history of the empire is only just beginning. The selection of a Vestal Virgin was an event steeped in ritual, secrecy, and ruthless precision. Rome's leaders would cast their eyes upon the daughters of noble families, seeking qualities that went beyond beauty or intelligence. The chosen girls had to embody an almost supernatural purity, a delicate balance between innocence and obedience, the kind of child who could withstand isolation without breaking, whose spirit could be molded like molten bronze. Families who offered their daughters did so with pride, but also with an unspoken dread. To be selected was to be honored, but it was also to be surrendered entirely to the will of the state and the gods. There was no turning back, no possibility of reprieve. Once selected, the girls were removed from their homes and communities, whisked away to the house of the Vestals, where the boundaries between nurturing care and strict indoctrination blurred into a harsh regime of control. The first months were the most disorienting. Familiar voices vanished, replaced by the monotonous chant of sacred prayers and the relentless observation of senior priestesses. They were not allowed to see their families freely, and the walls of the temple became their only constant companions. The air they breathed, the routines they followed, and even their dreams were shaped by an all-consuming demand for obedience. Each day brought lessons designed to ingrain the rituals of Vesta so deeply that thought itself became an instrument of devotion. Isolation was not just a physical state, it was psychological warfare. Removed from the familiar, the girls were compelled to internalize fear, reverence, and absolute loyalty. Every glance from a senior Vestal, every whispered correction, reinforced the ever-present reality. Failure was not a mere mistake. It was a catastrophe with consequences that could ripple through family lines and terrify the city itself. The environment cultivated both dependence and submission, creating young women who could endure unimaginable mental and emotional strain, their identities reshaped entirely in service to the sacred fire. The first experiences within the House of the Vestals were often marked by confusion and terror. The girls were subjected to silent trials, ceremonies whose meanings were veiled in mystery, designed to condition them to the harsh, unyielding life ahead. They learned quickly that secrecy was survival. A whispered word out of place, a hesitation in the EB ritual, or a flicker of doubt could mark them as unworthy, a shadow of imperfection that Rome's gods would not tolerate. Yet, within these trials, seeds of resilience were planted, forging the Vestals into figures of unwavering composure and terrifyingly disciplined virtue. Their isolation was the crucible in which the raw material of childhood was transformed into instruments of divine and civic power, a transformation that was as frightening as it was magnificent. By the time the girls reached the age to fully assume their sacred duties, they were no longer merely children. They had become part of a centuries-old machine, a living extension of Rome's devotion to its gods. The transition from innocence to duty was complete, leaving behind all traces of the world they once knew. And while outsiders admired the Vestals' serene composure, few could comprehend the depths of solitude, fear, and exacting discipline that had forged them. In their isolation, Rome's most dangerous and devoted servants were born, ready to guard the eternal flame with a life utterly surrendered to the city and the gods. The sacred fire of Vesta was far more than a flame. It was the heartbeat of Rome itself, an eternal symbol whose maintenance demanded absolute vigilance. The Vestal virgins bore the terrifying responsibility of tending this fire, a task that was deceptively simple in appearance, yet riddled with ritualistic danger and psychological strain. Each flicker, each spark, was laden with meaning. To let the fire die was not merely a mistake. It was a harbinger of doom, a sign that the gods themselves had turned away from the city. The fire was a mirror of Rome's fortunes, and the Vestals, bound by vows of chastity and obedience, were its guardians against chaos. Their rituals surrounding the flame were meticulously complex, blending the tangible with the symbolic. They performed rites that demanded precision and unwavering focus, from the careful stoking of the embers to the secret offerings made at midnight. Any deviation, however slight, risked invoking divine wrath, and the psychological toll of this constant scrutiny was profound. The Vestals lived in a perpetual state of tension, where even the smallest lapse could be interpreted as negligence or betrayal. Historical records hint at ceremonies conducted in the dead of night, cloaked in silence, where the girl's every movement was scrutinized, every misstep magnified into a potential catastrophe. Beyond the practical maintenance of the flame, the fire held a dark, occult significance. It was believed that the fire's purity mirrored the moral and spiritual integrity of the Vestals themselves. A failing in the flame could presage disasters such as famine, political upheaval, or military defeat. The girls internalized this belief, carrying a crushing burden. Their devotion was not only a spiritual duty, but a civic imperative. The weight of such responsibility created a psychological crucible in which fear and reverence fused into a singular, almost superhuman vigilance. The secrecy surrounding these rituals intensified their horror. Few outsiders could witness the Vestals at work, and even fewer could comprehend the symbolic violence embedded in their actions. Some accounts suggest that the rituals involved symbolic reenactments of death and rebirth, ceremonies designed to reinforce the Vestals' submission to divine authority and the fragility of human life. The sacred fire, ever burning, became a lens through which the harsh reality of their existence was magnified. Life itself was subordinated to ritual, and the human spirit was both the instrument and the sacrifice. Intending the eternal flame, the Vestals became living embodiments of Rome's fears and hopes. Their every gesture, every whispered prayer, was a silent testament to the city's fragility. The fire burned, not merely as a beacon of divine favor, but as a constant reminder of the perilous tightrope upon which these young women walked. The horrors of their devotion were invisible to most, yet for the Vestals, the flame was both salvation and torment, illuminating the extraordinary cost of guarding a city's most sacred secret. The punishments awaiting the Vestal virgins who broke their sacred vows were the stuff of nightmares, a terrifying intersection of law, religion, and ritualized cruelty. Rome demanded purity, and purity, when defiled, was not a private matter. It was a crime against the gods and the city itself. The infamous punishment for a Vestal who broke her vow of chastity was live burial, a fate that stripped away every trace of humanity and dignity. They were led to an underground chamber, provisioned with a small lamp and a minimal supply of food and water, then sealed inside the earth. The cold, suffocating stone became their final prison, and the shadows of the temple walls witnessed the horrors of ritualized annihilation. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological terror that preceded this brutal execution. The accused Vestal was paraded through the streets, her face pale and composed, yet undeniably trembling, every citizen's gaze a silent judgment. The ritual was meant to reinforce the consequences of transgression, a living reminder that the god's wrath could not be escaped. Scholars suggest that this punishment was as much a spectacle as it was a sentence, a performative act ensuring that fear spread through the city and that obedience to the sacred laws was absolute. The terror was not only personal but societal. It reminded every Roman that the equilibrium of their world rested upon the shoulders of a few chosen women. The psychological torment was matched by the ritualistic exactness of the process. Every step, every gesture, was governed by an ancient script, a choreography that blended fear, humiliation, and religious precision. The act of burial was not merely execution, it was a symbolic return of the transgressor to the earth, a purification, through suffocating darkness, intended to restore the city's spiritual balance. The Vestals' lives were entwined with the sacred fire, yet in their final moments they were abandoned to the consuming silence of the tomb, the eternal flame outside continuing its indifferent vigil. Even lesser punishments carried an almost equally oppressive weight. Vestals guilty of minor infractions faced public whipping, penance in isolation, or years of rigorous penance that eroded both body and spirit. Every punishment, no matter its severity, reinforced the totalitarian control the state and the gods held over these young women. There was no escape, no mercy beyond the framework of ritual. Fear was woven into every aspect of their existence, ensuring that the flame they guarded was never left unattended, their obedience never questioned. The stories of these punishments linger as stark reminders of the horrifying price of duty. The Vestals were revered, yes, but their reverence was inseparable from terror. Their lives and their deaths were instruments of the city's survival, their suffering both invisible and totalizing. For those who witness history through the lens of these ancient rituals, it becomes clear that the cult of Vesta was not merely a religious institution, but a sophisticated mechanism of control, fear, and absolute power. Share your thoughts below. What do you think about the unimaginable punishments these women endured? Leave a comment, and let's discuss the chilling reality of Rome's most feared priestesses. The daily life of the Vestal virgins was a delicate balance between devotion, discipline, and ceaseless observation. From dawn to dusk, every action was governed by a code that left no room for spontaneity or personal desire. The Temple of Vesta, with its towering walls and sanctified chambers, became both home and prison. The girls rose early, their mornings consumed by ritual ablutions, prayers, and meticulous tending of the sacred fire. Even the simplest tasks, such as sweeping the temple floors or arranging sacred objects, were infused with religious significance, each motion performed with exacting precision. Mistakes were not tolerated. They were recorded, judged, and often punished, a constant reminder that perfection was the only acceptable standard. Meals were quiet affairs, eaten in solitude or under the watchful eyes of senior priestesses. The Vestals were forbidden from certain foods and practices, and every prohibition served to reinforce the mental and spiritual control exerted over them. Conversations were monitored, friendships carefully managed, and laughter was a luxury rarely afforded. The isolation, though subtle, was total. It shaped their thoughts, bent their emotions, and created a mindset wholly devoted to ritual and obedience. Even moments of rest carried a shadow of tension. Dreams were sometimes interpreted as omens, and nightmares could be the source of additional penance or secret instruction. Education in the temple was relentless and multidimensional. Beyond learning the intricate rites and prayers, the Vestals were taught the history of Rome, its politics, and the sacred laws they were sworn to uphold. They became experts in ritual theory, symbols, and the delicate interplay between divine expectation and civic order. The constant emphasis on duty cultivated a psychological armor, a sense of unbreakable composure that would later define their public presence. Yet this armor came at a cost: the suppression of natural emotions, the erosion of personal identity, and the quiet terror of realizing that any lapse could trigger divine or civic catastrophe. Despite the rigid structure, moments of ritual performance could be mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. The Vestals moved with an elegance born of repetition, their chants a haunting echo through the temple halls, their gestures precise, almost mechanical in their devotion. Outsiders might have seen serenity and grace, but beneath the surface lay a current of fear, discipline, and exhaustion that never fully disappeared. The daily life of a Vestal was a relentless dance with perfection, a continuous rehearsal of obedience, and a ceaseless affirmation of Rome's dependence on their sacred vigilance. This balance of mundane duties and terrifying responsibility created women of extraordinary resilience. They became the living embodiment of Rome's most sacred ideals, a constant reminder that survival, whether of the city or the gods' favor, was never guaranteed. The pressures of daily life, hidden in plain sight, reveal a culture that thrived on control, fear, and devotion. A world where the personal cost of spiritual service was measured in silence, discipline, and the quiet erosion of the self. Beneath the veil of ritual and devotion lay the intricate entanglement of politics and power that defined the lives of the Vestal virgins. Their purity was not merely a spiritual mandate, it was a political instrument wielded by Rome's elite. Senators, magistrates, and even emperors understood the leverage that a Vestal could provide. An untouchable figure whose virtue lent legitimacy to decrees, emboldened campaigns, and reinforced social hierarchies. In the eyes of the populace, the Vestal's incorruptibility symbolized the stability of the state itself. Yet behind the public veneration lurked a grim reality. These women were pawns in a high-stakes game where devotion and manipulation intersected. The Vestal's influence extended far beyond the temple walls. Their mere presence could halt executions, sway judicial decisions, or bless political ventures with divine favor. Roman leaders often sought to align themselves with the Vestals, understanding that the goddess Vesta's approval, channeled through her priestesses, could sway public opinion and secure personal power. This invisible authority placed the Vestals in a precarious position. They were revered yet constrained, admired yet used, elevated yet perpetually scrutinized. Their personal desires and ambitions were subordinate to the currents of political machination, leaving them both powerful and powerless in the same breath. The tension between spiritual duty and political exploitation manifested in subtle, insidious ways. Arrangements and alliances formed around the Vestal's positions often determined the fates of entire families. A Vestal's favor could mean protection and prestige, while perceived failure or disobedience could trigger social disgrace, exile, or death. The boundaries between divine service and political instrument blurred, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Even the most disciplined Vestal could not escape the reality that her life, decisions, and very existence were intertwined with forces far beyond her control. Power, when combined with fear, became a tool for social engineering. The city's dependence on the Vestal's purity was manipulated by rulers seeking to consolidate influence, ensuring that these young women became both guardians of sacred tradition and instruments of political dominance. It was a life in which obedience was paramount, and yet each act of service resonated with unseen authority. The Vestals embodied the paradox of empowerment and subjugation, a living testament to Rome's understanding that control over the sacred was also control over society itself. The political dimension of the Vestals' lives magnified the stakes of their service to a staggering degree. The sacred fire they tended was not only a spiritual beacon, but also a symbol around which political ambitions revolved. Every ritual, every ceremonial gesture became a silent negotiation between divine mandate and civic power. In this shadowy intersection of piety and politics, the Vestals' lives were defined by both reverence and dread, a stark reminder that in Rome, devotion was inseparable from danger. Beyond the public ceremonies and visible rituals lay a hidden world of dark practices and occult rites within the Temple of Vesta. The Vestal virgins, bound by vows and submerged in secrecy, were sometimes witnesses to ceremonies that blurred the line between devotion and terror. While the sacred fire burned as a symbol of Rome's survival, its maintenance involved rituals that were both mysterious and psychologically taxing. Ancient texts hint at secret rites, where the Vestals, alone in the shadowed chambers, performed acts meant to purify not only themselves, but the city itself, engaging with symbols and gestures whose meaning was known only to the initiated. Some historians suggest that these rituals included symbolic reenactments of death and renewal, terrifying acts that demanded both concentration and unwavering courage. The Vestals moved through these ceremonies with a grace that masked their internal fear, each gesture deliberate, each incantation exact. The combination of isolation, secrecy, and ritual intensity created an atmosphere where fear and reverence were inseparable, where even the most disciplined could feel the oppressive weight of impending doom. The very walls of the temple seemed to pulse with the unspoken power of these acts, as if the shadows themselves were witnesses to the girls' obedience and terror. The dark rituals served a dual purpose: to reinforce the Vestals' absolute loyalty and to protect Rome through occult influence. Every chant, every ceremonial movement was intended to ward off disaster and maintain cosmic balance, yet the price paid by these young women was profound. They were instruments of a power that was invisible yet omnipresent, performing rites that outsiders could never comprehend, rituals that required a suspension of fear, a suppression of doubt, and an embrace of the incomprehensible. The psychological toll of such practices was immense. The Vestals' minds were shaped by shadows, trained to endure what no ordinary human should ever face. The danger was not only spiritual or psychological. Legends whisper that errors in these hidden ceremonies could result in misfortune, disease, or even the anger of Rome's gods. The constant awareness of this possibility instilled a perpetual tension in the Vestals' lives, a silent dread that accompanied every act of devotion. Even as the city thrived, the young women in the temple moved through a realm where the sacred and the terrifying were indistinguishable. Their world was one of beauty intertwined with horror, a delicate yet harrowing balance that few could survive without leaving scars invisible to the outside observer. The Vestals' engagement in these dark, occult practices underscores the extraordinary demands of their service. Revered as holy and untouchable, they carried the heaviest burdens in silence, performing acts that shaped the destiny of Rome while confronting the most unsettling aspects of their own humanity. The shadows in which they lived and worked were alive with secrets, and their obedience to these hidden rituals stands as a chilling testament to the terrifying depths of devotion. What do you think about the secretive and frightening rituals of the Vestals? Leave a comment below to share your thoughts on the terrifying reality behind Rome's most sacred cult. Within the seemingly sacred walls of the Temple of Vesta, stories of betrayal and intrigue unfolded with a chilling regularity. The Vestal virgins, despite their revered status, were not immune to manipulation, coercion, or exploitation. Some accounts speak of ambitious families maneuvering their daughters into the temple not purely out of devotion, but as strategic moves in the ceaseless chess game of Roman politics. Once inside, these young women navigated a labyrinth of power, where loyalty could be leveraged, trust could be weaponized, and a single misstep could reverberate through generations. The secrecy that cloaked the Vestals' lives also provided fertile ground for intrigue. Rumors of affairs, conspiracies, and clandestine communications circulated, often exaggerated by the city's gossip-hungry populace. Even the most disciplined Vestals found themselves enmeshed in subtle webs of influence, as the elite sought to exploit their perceived divine authority for personal gain. Some were coerced into supporting political agendas, while others became silent observers of plots they could neither confirm nor reveal. Their unique position made them both powerful and dangerously exposed. There were moments when the integrity of the Vestals was questioned, sparking public scandal and historical notoriety. Accusations of impurity, whether true or fabricated, could trigger severe punishments and devastate reputations, both of the priestesses and their families. The intertwining of sacred duty and human ambition created an environment where betrayal lurked behind every ritual, and where vigilance was as critical as devotion. The temple, while a symbol of Rome's eternal stability, was also a stage for personal and political conflict, each ceremony performed under the gaze of unseen adversaries. The psychological tension of navigating this web of intrigue was immense. The Vestals had to maintain an impeccable outward composure while constantly interpreting threats, judging loyalties, and avoiding pitfalls that could imperil both themselves and the city. Their lives were a study in duality: outward serenity, masking inner alertness; sacred devotion, masking strategic calculation. Every whisper, every glance, there lay the potential for danger, a reminder that Rome's most revered women were also its most vulnerable. Through these stories of betrayal and intrigue, the reality of the Vestal's existence emerges not as one-dimensional piety, but as a complex and perilous life defined by secrecy, manipulation, and high stakes. They were witnesses and participants in the hidden currents of Roman power, their lives intertwined with the fortunes of the city in ways both visible and invisible. In navigating loyalty, deception, and power, the Vestal's existence was a precarious balancing act, a testament to the human cost behind Rome's most sacred traditions. As centuries passed, the cult of Vesta gradually lost its influence, and the fate of the Vestal virgins became increasingly precarious. The rise of Christianity and the transformation of Rome's political and religious landscape eroded the once untouchable authority of the temple. What had been a central institution, pivotal to the city's spiritual and civic stability, began to fade into obscurity. The Vestals, once revered as embodiments of divine favor, faced a world that no longer revered the sacred fire they tended or the vows they upheld. The decline was neither swift nor gentle. Historical accounts tell of the final Vestals grappling with the collapse of centuries-old traditions. Temples were closed, rituals forbidden, and the sacred flame extinguished under the weight of new laws and religious priorities. These women, trained from childhood to dedicate their lives entirely to Vesta, suddenly found their roles meaningless in the eyes of the state. The psychological impact of this forced obsolescence was profound. Lifelong devotion rendered irrelevant, personal identities built around sacred duty left unanchored, and the world outside the temple increasingly alien and threatening. The final Vestals were subject to scrutiny and control under the new regime, stripped of privileges that had once set them apart. Their sacred authority became a historical curiosity rather than a practical power, and the pressure to maintain ritual purity shifted from divine expectation to historical legacy. Some attempted to navigate this transition quietly, living out their lives in isolation, while others were absorbed into Christian institutions or forced into secular servitude. The disappearance of their societal role was both symbolic and literal, marking the end of an era in which women's devotion had wielded tangible influence over the city's fate. Despite the official decline, legends and anecdotes of the Vestals persisted. Stories of their fearsome punishments, secret rituals, and unbroken vigilance continued to circulate, reminding later generations of the extraordinary burdens they bore. The cultural memory of the Vestals preserved both reverence and horror, casting their lives as a cautionary tale of devotion, control, and the human cost of maintaining sacred authority. In this twilight, the final Vestals stood as living witnesses to the fragility of religious institutions and the relentless march of history. A haunting echo of a world that demanded everything from a few chosen women and left them to confront an uncertain end. The legacy of the Vestal Virgins stands as a haunting reminder of the extremes to which devotion, fear, and ritual can shape human lives. From the moment of their selection as young girls to their final days tending the sacred flame, their existence was a tapestry woven with discipline, terror, and an unyielding sense of duty. Their lives illuminate the harsh intersection of divine expectation, societal pressure, and political manipulation, revealing how the most revered figures in Rome were also its most vulnerable. Every ritual they performed, every secret ceremony they endured, carried weight beyond their personal existence, extending to the survival of the city itself and the perceived favor of the gods. Even in death, or exile, the shadow of their service lingered. Stories of punishment, secret rites, and unwavering vigilance became the stuff of legend, preserving the chilling reality of the burdens these women bore. The Vestals' lives were a testament to the cost of devotion. Every personal desire sacrificed, every moment of fear endured, and every thought molded by the demands of sacred duty. They were living instruments of a society that conflated holiness with control, obedience with survival, and ritual with the ultimate authority over life and death. Reflecting on the cult of Vesta, one cannot help but feel the duality of reverence and horror intertwined in these women's existence. Their sacrifices shaped Rome's history, yet their personal suffering remained largely invisible to the citizens who revered them. The story of the Vestals challenges us to consider the extremes of human obedience and the terrifying power of tradition, reminding us that what is sacred can also be cruel, and what is revered can also be a cage. If you found the dark history of the Vestal Virgins as chilling as it is fascinating, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and watch our next video to continue uncovering the hidden horrors of ancient civilizations. Their story is a lesson in devotion, fear, and the terrifying cost of serving the gods. And it's a story that history has never truly forgotten.